Taking far too long aside, hey guys, Zimzilla today, and I will be reviewing the Teal Man with the name far too close to my own monster and pending a very long lawsuit, Zodagara by Nick Zilla 2005. Zodagara is a genetically engineered monster standing at 72 meters in height and over 150 meters in length. For reference, that would make him just a bit shorter than the 1984 Heisei Godzilla, but longer and 12 meters taller than Zeton from the original Ultraman. This makes him bigger than fairly large Showa monsters, but still smaller than smaller Heisei Kaiju. For added context, here is a diagram with Zodagara next to an 80-meter Godzilla and a Zeton, and here is a human all the way down right there. Looking at his coloration, we can see that there's two primary ones being used, those being gray and teal, making up separate portions of the body. Gray is the base color, oftentimes it is being seen as a boring color, however, it is a neutral one and allows for the second color to shine much more. In this case, that is teal. Teal being a combination of greens and blues, with one or the other adding to the shade being darker or lighter. It's often questioned whether or not teal is a green or a blue. Oftentimes people say teal is a greenish blue or a bluish green. However, I believe the fence-sitting nature of this color adds to the design fantastically. If the viewer feels that teal is closer to a shade of blue, then it may trigger in their mind that the creature is a sea monster, which it is, combined with many small details that add to its aptitude for sea life. If the viewer sees it as blue, then Zodagara is indeed a sea monster. However, if they also view it as green, then that will add to Zodagara's genetically engineered origins, as the creature is indeed a bioweapon, and teal and green are both colors associated oftentimes with Frankenstein, one of the preeminent examples of bioengineering gone wrong. It helps really using these colors, as they are already shown to be effective in the designs of other creatures, filling a similar niche, as it were. I'll be taking a slight detour away from the most vibrant color scene here, and that is because I feel that it'd be more important to talk about it in relation to the physical design of the character. And in this case, for this review, I'll be doing two reviews technically, and that is because the creator also gave me a second version of Zodagara, which is an alternate version seen here. Although he did not necessarily want me to review the alternate version, only the first one, I feel that there are some physical aspects of the second design, which when incorporated into the main design, will help the main design stand out even more. But let's get down to brass tacks, and in this case, genetics. Zodagara is a genetic anomaly and a chimera in that he's made up of various different genetics, and the base genome is said to be closely related to that of terrapins, which are a species of turtles. And for anyone who doesn't know, turtles are anapsids. They are a type of amniote with no external holes in their skull. So, Zodagara is not a dinosaur or even a lizard. He is more closely related to turtles. And in a lot of ways, this helps in terms of keeping the design a little bit more unique, as of course a lot of people love to use dinosaurs. I'm guilty of this. And looking at it compared to other turtle monsters, which usually just look mostly like giant turtles, the closest character that Zodagara looks like, you could say is Gamera. However, there's so much that is different from Gamera that Zodagara stands on his own just on first glances. Despite being an anapsid, Zodagara has some traits seen in other animal groups. The skin is described as elephantine, and the horn is similar to that of prehistoric mammals. Although turtles like the extinct Melilania species have horns on them, they aren't designed for defense like those in living rhinos, or species such as Eobacillus and Brontotheriidae. This also helps to create a more chimeric vibe for the creature, as it could be posited in the creature's lore that they use rhino DNA to create these structures. And although it isn't exactly like a rhino's horn or that of an extinct species, it could be posited too that the genes were modified to create a more suitable horn for military application, which adds further into the creature's backstory. Another distinct feature of the head is that of the spines that run along the cheeks. One of the creatures whose DNA has a big internal and external impact on Zodagara's appearance and genome are that of axolotls. This is more apparent in the tail, but if there's one thing these amphibians are known for, it is their gills that line the sides of their heads, which are small filaments that help with their breathing. Now, the regular design, we do not see these, but on the alternate version, we do. Another feature that differs between the two is that of the arms. Whereas the original has more defined figures, the other design has more web-like, almost flipper-like hands. This does remind me of another animal, but we'll get to that in just a second when I talk about a different part of the body. But then looking at the tails, we can also see that the original has a far more wavy design, which is closer to that of outdated depictions of mosasaurs, while the alternate version has a more tadpole or fish-like design. And finally with the legs, you can see that the first has more of a Godzilla 2014 bulky elephant sauropod look, while the other has almost more suction cup, almost gecko-like feet, which I think is also interesting. Now we finally get to that final important color, that being the red, which we see on the horns, the spines, and the tail fin. Although it is a little cooler shade of red than you usually see, and actually there are two different shades of red between the horn and the spines of the fins, they are still cooler shades that help to break up the teal and the gray. And it also helps that they are situated on the head and the tail respectively, essentially breaking up the design perfectly in terms of color distribution. Another detail that helps out with the color distribution is out of the shell. It's primarily black with a little bit of white speckling it. In terms of color, it's similar to that of a leatherback sea turtle, however in terms of shell and also function, it's quite different. Zodagara lacks any plastrons, which are those scales around the stomach of a turtle, which connect to the shell as a whole. Although it does not have these, the reason why is because of the origins of the creature. The shell was not present on the monster originally, it was actually something that was added on later, and because of that, there is none of that connective area there between the stomach and the back. I think this is a good design choice, as it still separates Zodagara from just a regular, almost turtle-like monster, while still having an aspect of the creature that they are known for. So overall, a good choice, which just leads to my final thoughts on the design as a whole. I think everything works well in terms of allowing Zodagara to appear like a chimera and a mix of different animals without being too, oh, I know exactly what this is from and I know what that's from, but there's enough illusion for someone to piece things together in their own mind and come to their own conclusions. One thing I will say, however, is I think that maybe there might be a better choice to add a little bit more teal to some areas. Even in my own sketch, the chest area has more teal because you only see it on the arms and the legs, and because of that, it may feel a little too patchworky in a less than serious way, and I feel that having maybe a lighter teal mixed in with gray may just help in terms of making the design feel a little bit more connected and whole, rather than just feeling like there is a teal here, gray here, and there's no kind of melding of those colors. I also feel that the little bits of axolotl on the body in terms of the alternate design I think work well with the original design, as I feel that although the tail is there, the spines I feel work better as those feeling materials there, and I will explain that further when we get to powers, as it helps in terms of making the creature feel more like a genetically engineered monster rather than an animal with these structures appearing naturally. And a small little aside before we get into origins, and it's that with the alternate Zodagara design, there's a lot of tubing around the neck, the arms, and the legs. This isn't intentional at all probably, but because the character is still genetically modified, I think it's similar to the bolts that you see on the movie version of Frankenstein's monster. So it's a small little detail that I draw a comparison to, and I really like that I can do that, and it just kind of helps me think of how well the designs are thought out. With origins, Zodagara and creatures like him are classed as gigantes. Gigantes are further classified into subcategories, each marked by a letter A through D, and if we want to be Greek about it, alpha, beta, gamma, delta. The word gigant also derives from the Greek word gigantus. The closest mainstream example of this kind of classification in kaiju media is the categories in the Pacific Rim universe. This kind of categorization allows for an easy way to know the power between monsters of which class they are, and what they're capable of. The disadvantage of the system, however, is that we know what the upper class and the lower classes are capable of with these monsters. The advantage of the Pacific Rim categories is that the strength can always keep on increasing. You can go from a category 5 to a 6 to a 7 and upward. But in the case of the gigantes, we know what the strongest monsters will be capable of because of the alpha class being the first one we start with, and therefore we can't make an alpha plus, etc. without it getting kind of convoluted. So power creep is going to be very, very much a problem with this categorization system unless it's changed to something closer to the category system, where you can keep on allowing the ceiling of power to increase rather than having to go from like alpha being the strongest and then just keep adding more letters to the alphabet until you finally get to 0 omega. And at that point, if you actually got to that point, then you have to find out what's going to be past omega if something's weaker than that, because alpha class has gotten so much stronger. So this is one aspect I think needs a little bit more work in terms of how you categorize them. Maybe you could still use the Greek alphabet system for its naming, however understanding where that power limit works and how the world build out better will be important. This is important because the scale is also tied to the abilities that Zodagara uses. The biggest of these abilities is that of the Javelin Rockets. How they work is that a jelly is formed in the throat and solidified via heat and velocity. When it is shot out like a gun or rocket launcher, the resulting object takes the shape of a missile or rocket, and when in contact with another object, the resulting explosion is equivalent to around 100 tons of TNT at apex power. Zodagara's throat and eyes glow a bright green before releasing the attack, and these rockets can be fired more than once and shot at multiple targets. So essentially, it works similar to that of a weapon that can fire both in select fire and automatic. So this idea is interesting. I like it. The idea of this monster essentially being a giant mobile walking launcher, like a Metal Gear kind of. But that aside, I think there is one issue I have with this, and that is the idea of what happens if there might be an accidental discharge. And of course, accidental discharges with guns is when a bullet is shot out or a pin is fired, and because of that, the whole reaction happens and it wasn't intentional. In Zodagara's case, the jelly is in the throat area, and that's what lines that throat entirely. What's stopping it from just any day activity or even other forms of combat to cause that material to solidify and essentially explode inside the mouth rather than being shot out itself? Like, that is something that really needs to be considered, and I think one thing that could be easily done to fix that is just having the material be produced internally rather than it being produced in the throat, and the throat is the only area where you see it actually visible on the body, and it's almost like a magazine where the throat essentially expands to like a magazine in a gun, and from there it is then shot out, and that can be something that can be done to visually present when Zodagara has a lot of ammunition to use, or is kind of low, or is reloading, where the throat essentially can kind of move in a way to look like it's producing more or having more stored in there before it fires, and that way it essentially in universe would explain why people who are creating a bioweapon would make something equivalent to a weapon and essentially using similar real-world philosophy so that the creature can fight more effectively. I think that this is important because it helps you as a creator tell your viewers that people in this world are thinking logically within the confines of sort of what we know about things like weapons and the like. And I just think that that's an interesting idea and maybe something that you can incorporate in yourself, but just something to consider. The mechanics of that ability just kind of need to be worked out a little bit more. And finally, you have the other two abilities. These are more defensive, and I'll just wrap them together. The first of those just being the active kind of rapid regeneration, and the shell. The regeneration being obviously a product of the axolotl DNA, which allows wounds like cuts, broken bones, and the like to be mended at a fast rate. And the shell, again, like I said, was a structure formed after an irradiant was pumped into the body, which allowed for that massive growth to appear. It's stated that iron in the blood is what caused that growth to appear. However, you're going to have to look and sort of see why iron would kind of form in this way if you really want to go into an explanation as to why. And I think it'd be a lot easier for yourself as to just say that it's a product of the mutagenic qualities of the irradiant that was put inside, or say it's a new kind of metal that's forming inside the body because of how the creature processes materials and the like. So instead of it being a specific metal, make it your own metal, and therefore sort of will build around why that's the case, because whenever you're dealing with specific material in the real world, you then have to explain why does the real world material act differently than you usually would in these circumstances. So that'd be just something to keep in mind. And the other one being the gill branches, or the little spines you see around the lower jaw, and almost like a biological sonar, as it were. Now that I've given an overview of the abilities, there are a few questions I would have. First is, how does Zodagara not suffer from what I've termed the Dreadnought Syndrome? This refers to a recurring problem that large superweapons tend to have. Namely, first off, being massive targets that are inviting to numerous tons of ordnance, along with using up too many resources, and as such, their power is often not worth the investment. Historical cases of this are the German Rata tank, which was actually never fielded, however was considered, and that would be a massive, colossal tank. The Japanese Yamato, which was fielded, saw limited action and was essentially beached the entire time. And for a fictional example, there is the supremacy from The Last Jedi. When it comes to Kaiju in war, we often forget about the biological needs of a creature, or things like minimizing civilian damage and casualties, cost, housing, etc. Oftentimes, Kaiju are also immune to conventional weaponry, so a lot of audience members feel like they're not going to have to worry about anything when an action scene arrives, because if it's not involving a super weapon or another monster, then the Kaiju's going to be fine. So I think the best thing to do in this scenario, when you're designing a monster, specifically a created creature meant to be a bioweapon, we have to think about it as a military asset. An opportunity I see with Zodagara is his gill branches. This sensory organ can essentially serve a secondary purpose of a radar jammer or a type of sonar. Essentially using electromagnetic waves, you could have it create its own sonar so Zodagara knows where things are, even if they aren't directly within his line of sight, or be able to essentially work like an EMP, shutting off vehicles, or just sort of messing with them. Essentially, if a drone is taken offline before it actually even encounters the target, it's not really going to do much. If a plane's coming at Zodagara trying to fire at him and it just goes offline, pilot's essentially in a giant metal box. Same goes for ships. If they can't really tell what's going on because all their equipment's on the fritz, and they essentially have to do almost anything manually. Therefore, Zodagara has the advantage of being this large monster that's able to engage all these different targets, while also not being a target itself that can be hit very easily because of its own natural defenses. Now, giving your characters a lot of advantages is good, it's awesome, and it's a fun process. However, I believe weaknesses grounds a character as well, and Zodagara has primarily two weaknesses. The first being high voltage. So electricity can stop his regeneration from occurring and can also actually short circuit his brain, which is partly mechanical. I do believe this choice was done primarily because the creator's second big character from his universe has primarily electrical attacks, so narratively, there's always that thought in your mind that the antagonist is just overtly stronger than the protagonist and has abilities that can directly counter and if not kill the protagonist instantly, so I think this is a good choice. The second weakness is that of extreme heat. This is characterized as degrading Zodagara's unstable genetic structure. However, this weakness is not lethal, but I believe something interesting could be done with that, in that, like the high voltage, it can also disrupt the regeneration process. This could come in the form of excessive regeneration, lost limbs regenerating misshapenly, or even extra appendages growing out, essentially adding a body horror element to this weakness. And this presents a challenge in that although the character is extremely powerful, and these weaknesses are going to be more done by other monsters, there's going to be that extra factor that could really help an audience understand that this is a big situation and could result in a lot of damage, if not mutilation, for the hero if he encounters this. Now, the last weakness, quote unquote, which is less a weakness and more a kill condition, is Disintegration. Essentially, if every cell in the body is destroyed, then Zodagara really isn't going to be able to come back. However, if one cell survives, then he is able to regenerate himself. Essentially, this is just Perfect Cell's ability in DBZ, where after he was blown away, he was able to regenerate from a single cell. And having these weaknesses not just helps build stakes, but can result in action taken in universe for natural world building. So what I mean by this is that governments seeing that Zodagara is weak to high voltage or intense heat can develop vehicles to help Zodagara deal with these, or other countries that are fighting against him or other monsters fighting against him, luring him to locations where such things can occur, such as high voltage towers or volcanoes, etc., etc. It's these ideas that allow you to then naturally come up with new scenarios for yourself, and it kind of can take your mind off the writing process in that it just comes a little bit more naturally. Now, both of Zodagara's main weaknesses have to do with the fact that they're disrupting his regeneration. I want to state this very bluntly, and it's that the regeneration can serve as a get-out-of-jail-free card for Zodagara and almost any other monster that possesses this ability. I also believe that every monster should have this ability. The reason I say that is that if you do want to have monsters stick around, then it does create a little bit of plausible deniability where a character can say the monster's dead, but because of their regeneration they can come back. However, this shouldn't be something that's abused. However, because of the fact that this regeneration is so powerful, there needs to be hard and fast rules to explain why this cannot be applied to medical research, because although it can be doctored and put into animal cells, who's to say someone in this universe, a really mad scientist or someone just trying to help the world, tries to apply this regeneration to humans, that opens up a whole bunch of new possibilities to the battlefield and just regular life that might need to be accounted for, especially if it's not something that you've thought of. And I think that's important anytime we think of powers for our characters, because we sometimes think, oh, this is a cool power, I want to add it, but we don't really think about how damaging or how important this is. Going back to even the original Godzilla, we see that Godzilla's atomic breath and just his presence alone emits radiation, and because of that, we're going to have to deal with the radiation sickness and all of the sort of malnourishment and after effects of this happening to people. I think that's one thing that's important and well done in Godzilla 54, and I think that's something you need to carry over into your own writing that I think some people sometimes lack because they just want to go for the rule of cool. Segueing into the setting, the universe takes place in the 70s. Gigants are rampaging across the world, and Zodagara is created to stop the threat. However, the project was shut down prematurely, and in response, a devoted scientist continued his experiments and was able to finish the monster, who was able to be fielded and fend off the other monsters. Overall, this setup seems very super robot-y in its plot beats and leads perfectly into a monster of the week kind of scenario. And this is good because this allows you to experiment with more smaller stories and essentially just get more content out there. If this was something you want to do as sort of a side gig and you're just giving out stories to publishers and the like, then having these smaller scenarios and being able to look at another genre and see how they were able to work with conventions and create new stories from a very simple concept, I think could work for you. However, although this is kind of a me thing, I do kind of stick to very specific word choice in a lot of things, and a synopsis that was given to me states that Zodagara's goal was to restore humanity, which implies they were probably in sort of a defensive or crippled state, similar to that of Evangelion or Pacific Rim, adding further to the veneer of this super robot kind of scenario. We see that Zodagara returns in the 80s, implying that the threat had returned and other monsters and new allies appear. However, sticking primarily to this 70s setting, it's a good start, and there's a lot of room for you to not only make smaller content that's easier to get out there, but also allows you to flex your skills as both a creator of characters, but also as a writer too. As for tone, it's described as kind of early Showa Godzilla, so I would say about 54 to about 68, and 80s films, which would be the likes of Commando, Aliens, Predator, RoboCop, and Terminator if we're talking about just sci-fi films, and with a bit of comedy, but not full comedic, but not a Marvel film or anything like that. And when it comes to that kind of tone, what I think of is a lot of masculine machismo in a good way, of course, and very bulky, almost cassette sci-fi in a way. And I think looking at a lot of sci-fi art from that time can help create a sci-fi world that is distinct and unique and also has your voice in it. So taking from the 80s films you really like and applying those aesthetics together in a way that meshes well is something I think you can do. But also looking at the greats, the films I mentioned are staples of both the 80s as well as sci-fi, and seeing sort of how those characters act, the comedy that's from that time is going to help make that feel real, because there's a lot of things that are made when it comes to films that are set within certain time periods. However, there's maybe certain lines or even dress that's going to take someone out of the experience, especially if they're versed in that time period. I know for myself specifically, since my own series Kaiju 2000 is primarily taking off aesthetic and the culture of the early 2000s, a lot of my music choice as well as speech or even the aesthetic of a lot of vehicles and like was something I wanted to do to make someone know that it was grounded within that time period's view of things. Essentially, that's why a lot of people who work with retrofuturism, for example, really have a understood look about things, because there's a lot of research and understanding into why these looks were the way they were. And I think that's something that you as a creator need to do so that your audience can really feel immersed in the world that you're trying to create. In conclusion, Zodagara has a well thought out design. It combines traits of very disparate animals with a greater context of it being a chimera, causes what can be seen as maybe an uncanny look to be on point and stand out, not to mention draw on the cultural osmosis of other characters similar to it. However, I feel in the realms of abilities and their applicability as a bioweapon, there could be some more work done in aspect to that character. Oftentimes, characters and creators limit their powers so they don't come off as overpowered or too tryhard, but due to Zoda being essentially a walking WMD that outclasses other weapon systems entirely, having a wider range of abilities or a more fleshed out understanding of what his abilities can do in a military context, I think is important. And I also believe that achieving this will help not only not compromise your character, but also excel it, especially if you want to talk about things like weapons acceleration or the effect WMDs as a whole have on a country or a culture. And if you focus on these things, I think that there's going to be a very good thematic core to your character, and outside of that, your design's awesome, so it carries it amazingly. That's all I have for you guys. I thank you all for watching the video. It's been too long. I'm so thankful I was able to get this out finally, and thanks to Gojin the Makai Phantom. He was the one who helped me edit this video. As I've been working on so many other projects, I have been so stuck behind in terms of doing longer YouTube videos, and with him helping me and me learning some other stuff as well, hopefully I can get these out quicker. But as always guys, take it easy.